Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I am your host, and I'm going to talk about embarrassing sexual encounters. I mean, I couldn't think of another word for it, but, it's those situations that happen in life. Some of them are pretty just, they happen, and others you kind of set yourself up for it because you just do things that expose your lack of sense, so to speak. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And this, in this one, I got to say how this happened. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. This is not me. I just happen to know about it. And this is what happened. I had a friend, this is all it was. She happened to have had a lot of suitors, and I'm going to say it that way. And I'm not judging, but when you hear about the situation that happened, I mean, the guys are generally more embarrassed than the girl is because her position on all of this is that, hey, these guys came to me and I got to hand it to her. She sure had a lot of male company. But in this particular instance, all the guys kind of knew each other, but she clocked them pretty well. And they didn't all show up at the same time, generally. And it's one of those situations in which, people tend to recognize something's going on. We all have that intuition that something is happening. And what tends to follow is, guys tend to respect the space of somebody else. If they see somebody else is there where they're spending their time, then they tend to respect that and they tend to find her on their own time. Well, in this particular experience, and when I heard about it, I was like, wow. The person, she had one of her friends came over and they were experiencing, a sexual, whatever you want to call it. They were mating and there was a knock at the door. Well, the guy, being who he was, feeling a bit exposed that someone else may show up when he was in the middle of the act, decided to run and hide. Well, what he wound up doing is he went and hid in the bedroom in the closet. Again, true story. So he went and hid. Well, the guy that showed up was a coworker, and seeing the guy's car out front, he knew that he was there. So when he walks in, he doesn't see him in the living room, and he doesn't see him in the kitchen or any place like that. So he goes through the house and starts walking, looking for the guy. And he finds the guy hiding in the closet in the bedroom, half dressed. I mean, if you could imagine what that must feel like to be discovered. And, well, okay, so what happens? Well, he put himself in that situation. I mean, the guy obviously had the inclination that he wanted to be with this woman and everything that comes along with it. Now, he knew she wasn't somebody who didn't have a lot of male company. But I guess for the moment, he figured that since it was him, that she couldn't have anybody else. I mean, I personally remember not having conversations with this guy in particular. But the minute she walked into my space, and mind you, she walked into my space, all of a sudden, he's over there trying to find out what the conversation is about. So I happen to have been someone who was privy to the information. I guess I was a shoulder to cry on if that were the case, but I was definitely a listening ear. I mean, here I am. I'm on a podcast sharing knowledge, information, my wisdom, whatever you want to call it, on these situations. So I've done this a long time, and I enjoy that part. But I happen to be sharing this story because it's an embarrassing sexual encounter. And if you find yourself in the company of someone who has lots of other company, and you go to her house or his house, if you're a woman who's involved with a guy who may have lots of female company, but if you find yourself in the company of someone who's like this, you may have this happen to you. And this isn't to say that you can't be intimate with whomever you consent to be intimate with. But people have a history. People have baggage. And when these kinds of things happen, and obviously they do, I mean, it's never happened to me. I've never been in this situation. I was just tickled to hear about it. And because, and you know what? It didn't end there. This situation actually happened more than once to the same person. So obviously he was persistent. I mean, he kept chasing this woman, and I mean, eventually this relationship situation sort of ended. But that's something that happened. And another thing, and I got to put this out there to any of you who think that these things don't get retold over and over. Now, I wasn't party to it when it happened. I happened to have been someone who was a listener as the story was being retold to me by one of the participants. The reputation, I mean, of this person was now forever changed in the minds of those who had high esteem for the guy who was hiding in the closet. You know, we can chuckle about it now because this was, was a not too terribly long ago, but it was a little while ago. I mean, we could chuckle about it now. But I think at the time, it was mortifying. Just tremendously embarrassing because all of these people knew each other. Now, I think it takes on a different tone when the people don't know each other. You know, you can be surprised. You don't have to see these people the day after at work. But when people show up, and the ones who show up are people that you actually know. And I might add, one of the individuals who was in this encounter actually already had a significant other. I almost left out that part. So how he justified that in his own mind, his own relationship is, that's something for him to work out. So again, that's an embarrassing sexual encounter. Something I want you to take into consideration, if you haven't learned this already, then I'm going to say it to you right now. Don't do anything you don't want somebody to know about. Because if it comes out, and it usually does, then if it's going to be compromising of your reputation or something in a way, you're going to have to learn some restraint. And if you're having trouble with establishing boundaries, then you need to get help with that. We got to go in a whole different direction to work on that. But it's these experiences. Now, the fact that you have sex with somebody is no big deal. It's something humans have been doing all the time. But in light of the type of encounter that it is, who it is, the people that are involved, and the stories and the connections and things. Like I said, if this were to be on the news, would that person be embarrassed? Yeah, that person would have been. No, I've had a situation in my own personal life where somebody tried to imply that I was doing something wrong or was afraid. Well, look, I wasn't involved with anyone to even worry about what this person might try to say or might try to pull on me. So I felt very confident in that situation. And the person I was dealing with was certifiably crazy. I mean, seriously. And I think we've all had the relationship person from where, and they try to pull a lot of stuff. They're about trying to destroy your reputation or about power and control. And I was able to bat that back with ease because, again, I had nothing to hide. I had nobody that I was trying to hide my life from. But in the instance of when you do have something that you're trying to keep undercover, situations like this can get out of hand really fast, and people who are twisted will manipulate the situation to their advantage. And it might cost you your reputation. It might cost you money. It can be fairly expensive. Look, I'm going to take a break, and I'll come right back after this. We're talking about embarrassing sexual encounters.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about embarrassing sexual encounters. So I have another story that I can share with you. It happened. Now, when the woman was married, she's married to the guy and had a little bit of flatulence. Okay, that's passed a little bit of gas. It was embarrassing to her, but the reaction that he gave to her was one of disgust. I mean, it's a little something that happens. It's very natural. But you know what was the sad part about it is she was embarrassed, but he made such an issue about it. It really became a sticking point for her to that she did not want to be intimate with him anymore, or at least to the extent that he'd embarrassed her. And from that point on, when somebody becomes embarrassed in a situation like that, now they want it to be perfect. And how is it that what makes a sexual experience perfect? Well, obviously it's going to take a lot of work, and I can't imagine what that is. I mean, it may feel great at the end. That's an assessment we make after it's done. But when you have to do a whole lot of stuff ahead of time, it becomes something that is more work than some people can put into it. So they would just rather not. So what that created was a situation with intimacy was not allowed to flourish. Now, why am I sharing this story? It's an illustration of what happens in those vulnerable moments. And when that happened, how traumatizing it was to the woman who just passed a little bit of gas. It was just a sound. I mean, it wasn't like it was stinky or anything like that from what I recall her telling me. But she was mortified because her husband made such a deal about it that she felt ashamed, and she didn't want to embarrass herself, didn't want to put him through anything. Just that whole experience, it really shut down that part of the relationship. Just that one thing. And for what it did to her after that, remember, I'm actually hearing the story from her, and I could see the pain in her face. I could hear it in her voice at what happened. So, I mean, imagine if this were something to happen. Please be tender at somebody's most vulnerable moment. And as a reciprocal, now I can share this from being a guy. So that message was to guys, thinking of how sometimes in the moment you can be maybe not so thoughtful about some of the comments that you make. Now, on the flip side of this, because I like to give both sides of these situations, guys experience the premature ejaculation or the circumstance in which they can't last very long. And how embarrassing is that? Well, for guys, it's very embarrassing. They know that they are expected to put up, and I can guarantee There are a lot of guys out there that have been selling it like they are the best thing since you know what. So the woman says, okay, it's on. Got all of these plans that they're going to be lovemaking for, hours and hours. And what do you know? As soon as the clothes come off, they get started, they get going. It doesn't last 5 minutes. And I know women, and when that disappointment sets in, because it takes women considerably longer to get revved up and to get going. Oh yeah, they can feel a little heat, a little excitement, in the short term, because that's all part of their building up. But when in fact you get into the really intense physical stuff and it happens just for a few moments rather than a few moments, it's a game changer. I've known women who have expressed this, again, not from my personal experience from having it like that, but when because I do a lot of research here, I talk and get their interpretation on it. They have been furious because these guys sell themselves as having been the best thing since you know what. Now, ladies, what I can tell you is going through a guy's mind at that time is he's embarrassed. He's trying to come up with a reason, an excuse that would seem plausible at this moment for having sold it as being something that he's really going to be all that great in bed, and then there is this disappointment. And it's not as if guys don't know how to do better. I mean, guys know about foreplay. They've known about it for years. I mean, it's been talked about over and over again. What happens is guys get a little greedy. They get inconsiderate. They start thinking about themselves, thinking they can handle the situation when they can't. So what happens, they wind up finishing a little fast, and there is no gas left in the tank. And, they do traditional roll over, don't touch me kind of thing. If they're embarrassed, or even sometimes they may get up and just, because they can't think of anything better to do. Now, I'm not saying you have to save them at that moment, but I think maybe it's the words that are said. As I had shared in the other illustration about the woman who, had, passed a little bit of gas there at that moment. It's what he said is what really hurt her feelings. And it just gave an exclamation point on that moment that she was not able to erase from her mind. Hence, years down the road, she was telling me about it and expressing still some pain about that particular situation. So in light of experiences like this that happens, how we react really can set in place what's going to happen in the future. Vis-a-vis the husband's reaction to the little situation with the gas hurt her feelings. She needed to work through that. With a guy who, say, has a problem with controlling his premature ejaculation or not having much stamina, again, that's something he's going to have to work on. And I certainly believe, especially in these vulnerable moments, because I don't care what guy is there, when he can't perform, because guys are very performance oriented. I mean, guys worry about the size of their member. They're worried about if, the last guy that you were with is better than they are. And then when they step up to the plate and they cannot perform, yeah, it's going through his mind a lot. He is embarrassed. And I don't care how confident he sounded before. He has just failed to deliver. And as a woman, there are a number of things that you can say about that situation that are going to stick in that guy's mind, and they aren't going away. So, what not to say? Well, one of which is said, wow, that didn't last very long. That's obvious that it didn't last very long. And another thing is, what happened? Well, it's obvious what happened. He failed to perform. But in this instance, what happened means that he has to give you a reason right now. And you know what? He really doesn't have one. It might be medical. It could be some other things. And here's another one that happens. And this one isn't simply age related. It's not just older guys. Some guys have a hard time getting it up. And anxiety can produce some really unusual reactions and stuff. Yeah, I can make them jump in it and finish way too quick, and it can also make it almost impossible for a guy to even come up with an erection. And that happens. I'm going to take a break, and I'll come right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm talking about embarrassing sexual encounters, and as I was illustrating in the last segment about things not to say that embarrasses your partner, and why? Because these are very vulnerable moments, and when you say something that is, say, potentially, it spotlights it in a negative way, it can do some damage. I mean, people need counseling after stuff. I mean, there are some ugly things that we can say to each other. And I'm not saying that people don't deserve it sometimes, but just avoid adding to the meanness in the world. Now, here's a scenario I'm just recalling now as I'm doing this podcast. I was a cable TV installer at one time. True story. Absolutely true story. I was a cable TV installer, and one of the tasks that you have is when you're setting up the television, you get a location of where you need to bring the cables and things into the home, and you do outside work, and then you come in and you kind of finalize things. So in this particular instance, the husband and wife and the kids were home because I was obviously given entry into the place where I was, conducting all the work. And I said, okay, I need to go outside and do the work on the pole, and I'll come back in and hook up the television and things in a short amount of time. Now I'm a professional, so I'm working this. I'm a contractor, so I have to stay on task. And I wasn't outside too terribly long, but the moment I walked back into the house, now you would have imagined that these people could have heard me coming in. I had my work boots on. Well, Mr. and Ms. were on the living room couch going at it when I came through what would have been a back door through the kitchen towards the living room. I says, I didn't make any noise. I just turned around and walked back out because I didn't want to embarrass anybody. But clearly, as it were, some short time later, I came back to the front door, knocked on the door just to have entry so I could finish my job. And he had this look on his face that he was embarrassed. I didn't say a word. I just went on ahead, finished hooking up the TV, and walked out. Remember, I was the professional in this case. I'm just here to install the cable for the television, get the TV up and running, hook up the VCR if, back then that's what they had. Now we have DVRs. And I was out. And I'm sure he's telling this story, and I'm telling this story, but it was something that happened, and it wasn't embarrassing for me. Because, I didn't have my pants off and doing it. And I guess they felt pretty natural about what they were doing, but I just think they could have done something a little different or waited till I was finished because I did need to come back in. And who knows? Maybe they are just exhibitionists and that's what they enjoyed doing. But that, to me, potentially had the embarrassing thing, only because when we were sitting down at the table and he had to sign some paperwork, it was almost like there's an elephant in the room and nobody's saying anything about it. So, but that's a story. But see, but I left them intact. And that's how I wanted to remember myself in how I handled the situation. And I have another true story. This other job, I was actually a delivery person. And I guess summertime is when these things happen again. I should share this last story about the cable TV guy. It was during the summer. Well, this next story kind of happened the same way. And people had the screen door open, and I had to make a delivery. But I had to get a signature, so I had to knock on the door. And lo and behold, they're going at it. And I had to interrupt them. Didn't want to interrupt them, but I couldn't come back later because I was going to be leaving the area. So I just sort of turned my head and allowed them to get themselves covered up. Say, hey, I just need a signature. Had them sign for it. And I left out. Yeah, those things happen. And, what do you do? I never saw these people again. So in that case, there was nothing that was going to ever come of it. But if you have the kinds of situations where, let's say you walk in on somebody, let's say you live there, it's a roommate, what do you do? Well, you create some ground rules about this thing. If you have a partner that's coming over and you need your private time, then establish some rules around the apartment or house or whatever it is. I don't know, hang something on the doorknob. Hey, I've got company. Practice doing your fun stuff, your personal business, your private stuff in your own space. If you have a room in the apartment or the house, then stick to your room and don't necessarily do it out in the common areas. That's going to save you the embarrassment of being exposed, and because you're not sharing. This is not what that's about. You have your own space, your own personal situation. Now, in the case of if you have young kids, it may be a situation in which you have to lock the door so that the kids don't come in and see you in compromising positions. Now, if you've had conversations with your kids about the birds and the bees and you're not uncomfortable with your kids seeing you have an intimate time with your significant other, then that's something you're going to have to work out. I think that is something that should be done in private, and that's my opinion. So that would be my advice going forward, because you don't want kids experimenting with something like that, because kids will see something and then they will model that experience, that behavior. And that is why you don't want them seeing it, because kids will experiment with stuff totally. You won't know it, but you may find out about it in maybe a not so nice way, one of which may include you hear about your kid having some sort of grinding experiment with another kid down the street, and that can be a little embarrassing. So that's why I say you got to be careful, because kids are very impressionable. Now, I want to leave you with a thought, and it's more of a philosophical statement, but it bears understanding because of where some of these situations end up on the embarrassment scale. And it would be this. As long as you are above board, meaning, for example, if you are in a monogamous relationship and you are not having encounters with somebody else, then whatever happens, it happens. And you can live through it. You may even laugh about it, joke about it. And we do that as human beings. Things happen, we forget about them. But if there in essence is some sort of betrayal, meaning you are with somebody who you shouldn't be with, and you don't have that worked out in advance, then those are the kind of situations that are going to lead to embarrassing encounters that will be remembered. Words are going to get said, exchanged, however you want to put it. And those are the ones that are hard to put away. Those are very challenging to put away. So if you want to think about beforehand, because when you're in the moment, you're not going to be thinking about this stuff. And I know for some people it's about the forbidden fruit, so they experiment and they try things. But you got to be clear-minded about this. And that's why I say you got to take the time before these situations to think about how this is going to end up. Like I say, most things in life people are going to find out about. And this day and age, when you have cell phones that track every movement that you make, it's not as if somebody can't find you if they're really looking to prove, hey, you were here with so-and-so. I mean, and not everybody's a detective, but it's just the idea. There is a fingerprint everywhere you go in the world nowadays, and you can't hide it. So if somebody's looking for dirt on you, they can find it. So make sure that whatever dirt they find, it's not something that's going to hurt you. It's something you can put in a flower pot and grow plants with it, because your reputation may be at steak. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, talking about embarrassing sexual encounters.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.